A chance encounter. The morning sun cast long shadows across Houston's downtown streets as Melania Trump's sleek black limousine wound its way through the less affluent neighborhoods. The contrast between the vehicle's polished exterior and the worn buildings lining the route was stark, a visual reminder of the economic divide that plagued the city. Inside the car, Melania sat with perfect posture, her red Dior dress a vibrant splash of color against the dark leather interior. She held a small stack of note cards, reviewing her speech for the upcoming charity event. This wasn't her first such appearance, but something felt different today. Perhaps it was the rawness of the poverty she witnessed through the tinted windows, or maybe it was the growing unease about the effectiveness of these carefully orchestrated visits. "We're approaching the community center, Mrs. Trump," her chauffeur announced, his voice professional and detached. Melania nodded, tucking the cards into her designer purse. The community center came into view, a modest building with peeling paint and a sign that had seen better days. As the car slowed to a stop, her assistant Claire materialized beside the vehicle, tablet in hand. "Remember, Mrs. Trump," Claire said, her voice low and efficient, "we're on a tight schedule. A brief speech, some photos, and then we need to be on our way to the next engagement." The security team moved with practiced precision, forming a protective barrier around Melania as she emerged from the car. Agent Stevens, the lead Secret Service agent, scanned the area with hawk-like attention, his earpiece crackling with constant updates. They had made it halfway to the entrance when a small figure darted out from behind a nearby dumpster. The reaction was instant. Agents tightened their formation, hands moving toward weapons. "Stop right there." Agent Stevens barked, his command echoing off the building's walls. But Melania had caught a glimpse of their supposed threat, a young girl in a tattered blue dress, now frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. "Wait," Melania said softly, placing a restraining hand on Agent Stevens' arm. "It's just a child." The agent hesitated, then nodded curtly. He approached the girl, conducting a quick security check before stepping aside. Melania moved forward, kneeling down despite Claire's barely audible gasp of protest. Up close, she could see the dirt smudged on the child's face and the worn fabric of her dress. "Hello there," Melania said gently, her accent soft and warm. "What's your name?" The girl fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her voice barely above a whisper. "Poppy. I'm 9. It's nice to meet you, Poppy." Melania smiled encouragingly. "Where's your mother?" Poppy's lower lip trembled slightly. "I don't have a mother. My dad, he's sleeping in the alley. In a tent." The words hit Melania like a physical blow. She had known intellectually that people lived in such conditions, but to be confronted with the reality of it, embodied in this small, vulnerable child, was something else entirely. "Are you hungry?" Melania asked, her voice thick with emotion. When Poppy nodded, Melania opened her purse without hesitation and withdrew some cash. She pointed to a nearby hot dog stand. "Why don't you get something for you and your father?" Instead of taking the money, Poppy surprised everyone by throwing her arms around Melania in a spontaneous hug. For a moment, Melania froze, acutely aware of the dirt that would surely transfer to her expensive dress. But then something shifted within her. She wrapped her arms around the small girl, returning the embrace with genuine warmth. As Poppy scampered off toward the hot dog stand, Claire stepped closer, her expression concerned. "Mrs. Trump, we really should head inside. The event coordinators are waiting." But Melania's attention remained on Poppy's retreating figure. "Tell me about this neighborhood, Claire. What resources are available for families like Poppy's?" Claire consulted her tablet, though Melania suspected it was more habit than necessity. "There are several shelters in the area, but they're usually at capacity. The community center offers some programs, but funding is limited. It's complicated." "Complicated," Melania repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. She watched as Poppy reached the hot dog stand, standing on tiptoe to place her order. What circumstances lead to a child living on the streets? Various factors, Claire replied, her voice professional but gentle. Job loss, medical bills, addiction, mental health issues. Sometimes it's a combination of things. The system isn't equipped to handle the complexity of these situations. Melania frowned, a feeling of disquiet settling over her. She had done countless charity events during her time as First Lady, but something about this encounter felt different. The carefully crafted speech in her purse suddenly seemed inadequate, its polished phrases hollow in the face of Poppy's reality. As they finally made their way into the community center, Melania's mind was elsewhere. The bustling charity event, with its well-dressed donors and carefully arranged refreshments, felt surreal after her encounter with Poppy. She moved through the motions, greeting organizers, shaking hands, posing for photos, but her thoughts kept returning to the little girl in the blue dress. The speech she delivered was different from the one she had practiced in the car. While she kept to the basic structure, her words carried a new urgency, a deeper understanding of the stakes involved. She spoke about the human cost of poverty, about the children who bore the burden of circumstances beyond their control. We must remember, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room, that behind every statistic is a human story. A child who goes to bed hungry. A family struggling to keep a roof over their heads. A veteran who has given everything for our country, now finding themselves without support. As she spoke, Melania couldn't help but notice the contrast between her audience, well-fed, well-dressed, sipping coffee from paper cups, and Poppy, who had probably never known such comfort. The disparity made her uncomfortable in a way she had never experienced before. When the speech ended, Claire efficiently guided her through the rest of the schedule, photos with key donors, a ceremonial check presentation, brief conversations with local officials. But Melania felt disconnected from it all, going through the motions while her mind wrestled with larger questions. As they prepared to leave, Melania paused at the entrance, scanning the street for any sign of Poppy. The hot dog stand was still there, but the little girl was nowhere to be seen. She felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "Mrs. Trump?" Claire prompted gently. "The car is ready." Melania nodded, allowing herself to be guided toward the waiting vehicle. But as she reached for the door handle, a small voice cut through the air like a knife. "Don't drive." The urgency in the voice made Melania turn. There was Poppy, running toward them, her blue dress fluttering in the breeze. Before anyone could react, the girl planted herself in front of the car, arms spread wide. "Don't drive," she repeated, her voice shrill with panic. "Please." Agent Stevens moved to intercept her, but Melania held up a hand, stopping him. There was something in Poppy's voice, something beyond mere childish impulse. The girl's face was etched with genuine fear. "What's wrong, Poppy?" Melania asked, stepping closer despite her security team's obvious discomfort. "The wheel," Poppy said, pointing to the front tire. "They put something in it. I saw them." The chauffeur immediately moved to investigate, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed Poppy's warning. There, wedged into the tire, was a knife, positioned in such a way that it would have caused a catastrophic blowout once the car gained speed. The revelation sent the security team into high alert. Agent Stevens began barking orders into his radio while other agents secured the perimeter. But Melania's attention remained fixed on Poppy, who stood trembling but determined, her small face set with resolve. "You saved us," Melania said softly, kneeling down to Poppy's level. "But how did you know? Who did this?" Poppy's lower lip trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Bad people," she whispered. "They hate rich people. They told me to distract you this morning. But I couldn't let them hurt you. You were nice to me." The implications of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. The morning encounter hadn't been chance, it had been orchestrated. But something had gone wrong with the plan. Instead of playing her assigned role, Poppy had chosen to protect the very person she was supposed to help harm. As the security team called for backup and began a thorough sweep of the area, Melania found herself looking at Poppy with new eyes. This child, who had every reason to distrust someone in Melania's position, had chosen to do the right thing, potentially at great risk to herself. "Poppy," Melania said, her voice gentle but urgent, "these people who did this, do they know where you and your father stay?" The girl nodded, fear clouding her features. "They live in the same alley. They'll be angry that I told." Melania straightened up, her decision made. "Claire," she said, turning to her assistant, "cancel my remaining appointments for the day." "But Mrs. Trump," Claire protested, "the schedule can wait," Melania finished firmly. "We have more important matters to attend to." As the sun began to set over Houston, casting long shadows across the street, Melania Trump found herself standing at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. The day that had begun as a routine charity appearance had transformed into something far more significant. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, a little girl's act of courage had set in motion events that would change multiple lives forever. Hidden truths. The alley's entrance loomed before them like a portal to another world. Agent Stevens positioned his team strategically, their dark suits incongruous against the graffiti-covered walls. Melania stood slightly behind them, her red dress now bearing the dust and grime of the day's unexpected events. Beside her, Poppy fidgeted nervously, her small hand clutching the fabric of Melania's skirt. "They usually meet in the room with the rusty door," Poppy whispered, pointing toward a dilapidated structure halfway down the alley. "That's where Mike plans everything." Agent Stevens relayed this information through his earpiece, his voice barely above a murmur. The local police had arrived, positioning officers at both ends of the alley. The operation was taking shape with military precision, but Melania could feel the tension crackling in the air. "Mrs. Trump," Claire said softly, her tablet forgotten for once, "perhaps we should wait in the car while the agents—" "No," Melania interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. "I made a promise to help, and I intend to keep it." She looked down at Poppy, who was watching the agents with wide eyes. "Tell me more about your father, Poppy. How did you end up here?" As the security team coordinated their approach, Poppy's story emerged in hesitant fragments. Her father, James Carter, had served in Afghanistan. A battlefield injury had cost him his leg and, eventually, much more. The medical bills had drained their savings. The VA benefits had gotten tangled in bureaucratic red tape. His wife, Poppy's mother, had left, unable to cope with the changes in their lives. "Grandma helped us for a while," Poppy explained, her voice small. "But then she got sick, and the hospital bills." She trailed off, but the implications were clear. The spiral of poverty had been swift and merciless. Melania felt her heart constrict. The story was painfully familiar, she had heard similar tales at countless veterans' events. But hearing it from a child's perspective, understanding how these systemic failures had shaped Poppy's young life, made it devastatingly real. A burst of activity at the alley's end interrupted their conversation. The agents had begun their move, advancing silently toward the building Poppy had identified. Melania drew the girl closer, shielding her from whatever might unfold. The next few minutes passed in tense silence. Then suddenly, the quiet was shattered by shouts and the sound of splintering wood. "Police! Don't move!" The commands echoed off the alley walls, followed by the sounds of a brief struggle. Agent Stevens's earpiece crackled to life. He listened intently, his expression grim but satisfied. "They've apprehended several individuals," he reported. "Including the one called Mike." As if on cue, a group of men emerged from the alley, led by Secret Service agents and local police. Their hands were cuffed behind their backs, their faces a mixture of anger and defiance. One man in particular caught Melania's attention, tall and gaunt, with a serpentine tattoo crawling up his neck. When his eyes landed on Poppy, they blazed with fury. "You little rat," he snarled, lunging forward despite his restraints. "Your old man's gonna pay for this." Melania stepped in front of Poppy, shielding her from the man's venomous gaze. Agent Stevens quickly intervened, ordering the officers to remove the prisoners from the scene. But the man's threats continued to echo, "This isn't over. We've got people everywhere." Once the area was secured, Melania knelt down beside Poppy, who was trembling slightly. "It's all right now," she assured her. "They can't hurt you anymore. Can you show us where your father is?" Poppy nodded, leading them deeper into the alley network. The further they went, the more the urban landscape transformed. Makeshift shelters lined the walls, some constructed from cardboard, others from tattered tarps. Shopping carts overflowed with belongings, testament to lives reduced to what could be carried. They found James Carter's tent at the end of a narrow passage. It was slightly larger than the others, its faded blue fabric patched in several places. A small American flag, worn but carefully maintained, hung from a piece of twine near the entrance. "Dad?" Poppy called out softly. "Are you there? I brought help." There was movement inside the tent, and then a man emerged, blinking in the fading daylight. James Carter was tall, though he stooped slightly, favoring his prosthetic right leg. Despite his weathered appearance and worn clothes, there was an unmistakable military bearing to his posture. When he recognized Melania, his eyes widened in shock. "Mrs. Trump," he stammered, automatically straightening his stance. What's going on here?" Over the next few minutes, Melania and Agent Stevens explained the situation, the sabotaged car, Poppy's warning, and the arrest of Mike and his associates. As they spoke, James's face cycled through a range of emotions, pride in his daughter's bravery, shame at their involvement with the group, and fear for their future. "Sir," Agent Stevens said, his tone respectful but firm, "we need to understand your connection to these individuals. They've made threats against both you and your daughter." James sank onto a crate outside his tent, running a hand over his face. "After I lost my leg," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "everything fell apart. The medical bills, the endless paperwork with the VA, my wife leaving. I was angry. So angry at the system that I felt had abandoned us." He looked at Poppy, who had moved to stand beside him. When Mike and his group started talking about wealth inequality and social justice, it felt good to have someone to blame. But I never wanted Poppy involved. I tried to distance us from them, but... He gestured helplessly at his surroundings. "It's not easy to just walk away when you have nowhere else to go." Melania listened intently, her mind already working through possibilities. She had connections with veterans organizations, rehabilitation centers, housing programs. But she knew from experience that navigating these systems required more than just good intentions. "Mr. Carter," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I want to help, not just with this immediate situation, but with giving you and Poppy a real chance at a fresh start. There's a veterans shelter near here, one that the Trump Foundation supports. They have comprehensive programs for housing, job training, and education." James looked skeptical. "With all due respect, ma'am, we've heard promises before. From the VA, from social services." "Dad," Poppy interrupted, her voice small but determined. "Please. I don't want to be scared anymore." Something in James's expression crumbled at his daughter's words. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, we'll try." As the sun set over Houston, casting long shadows across the alley, Melania began making calls. Claire, efficient as ever, was already coordinating with the veterans shelter. Agent Stevens arranged for additional security measures, ensuring the Carters' safety during their transition. Watching Poppy help her father gather their meager belongings, Melania felt a profound shift in her perspective. The carefully orchestrated charity events, the speeches, the photo opportunities, they all had their place. But this, she realized, was where real change happened, in the messy, complicated work of helping one family at a time. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Trump?" It was Poppy, holding something in her hands. "I want you to have this." It was a small drawing, done in crayon on a piece of scrap paper. It showed two figures, one tall in a red dress, the other small in blue, holding hands. Despite its childish execution, the love and hope captured in those simple lines brought tears to Melania's eyes. As she carefully tucked the drawing into her purse, Melania made a silent promise. This wouldn't be just another feel-good story, a brief moment of charity soon forgotten. She would see this through, ensure that Poppy and James received the support they needed to rebuild their lives. The day that had begun with a routine charity appearance had transformed into something far more meaningful. And somewhere in the gathering darkness of a Houston alley, hope had taken root in the most unexpected of places. New beginnings. The Veterans Hope Center stood in stark contrast to the alley they'd left behind. Its modern three-story building, with its well-maintained grounds and welcoming entrance, represented everything the Carters had been denied for so long. As their police escort pulled up to the facility, Melania could feel the tension radiating from James Carter, who sat rigid in his seat, his prosthetic leg stretched out awkwardly in the cramped space. "It's pretty," Poppy whispered, her face pressed against the window, taking in the flowering bushes that lined the walkway. Her blue dress, now clean after a stop at a department store, still bore the wrinkles of its previous life, but her eyes sparkled with renewed hope. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the center's director, was waiting for them at the entrance. A former military physician with 20 years of experience working with veterans, she carried herself with quiet authority. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, and laugh lines around her eyes suggested a woman who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly, extending her hand. "We've been expecting you. And this must be Poppy." She knelt down to the girl's level, her smile genuine. "I hear you're quite the brave young lady." Melania watched as James struggled to maintain his composure. She had seen this before, pride warring with necessity, dignity grappling with circumstance. But Dr. Martinez seemed to understand instinctively, guiding them inside with professional efficiency that demanded no immediate emotional response. The interior of the center was bright and welcoming, but not luxurious. Everything served a purpose, from the wide hallways that accommodated wheelchairs to the clear signage directing residents to various services. As they toured the facility, Dr. Martinez outlined their comprehensive program. "We believe in addressing the whole person," she explained, leading them through a modern physical therapy room. "Medical care, psychological support, job training, education, everything works together. And," she added, looking at Poppy, "we have an excellent on-site school program for our residents' children." James, who had been quiet throughout the tour, finally spoke. "And the security?" Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious. "We take safety very seriously, Mr. Carter. Given your situation, we've arranged for additional measures. All entrances are monitored 24/7, and we have a direct line to local law enforcement." As if to emphasize this point, Agent Cooper, one of the Secret Service members assigned to the case, stepped forward. "We'll maintain a presence here until we're certain all members of Mike's network have been apprehended," he assured them. They reached what would be the Carters' new home, a small but well-appointed two-room suite with basic furniture and large windows overlooking a courtyard. Poppy immediately ran to the window, pressing her hands against the glass. "Dad, look! There's a playground." For the first time since their arrival, James smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. Melania felt something tight in her chest loosen at the sight. "Before we get you settled," Dr. Martinez said, "there's some paperwork we need to complete. And Mr. Carter, our medical team would like to evaluate your prosthetic. From what I can see, you're well overdue for an adjustment." James unconsciously shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "The VA waiting list is no longer your concern," Melania interrupted gently. The Trump Foundation is covering all expenses for your treatment. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. While James underwent his medical evaluation, Poppy was introduced to Ms. Thompson, the center's education coordinator. The older woman's gentle manner and genuine interest in Poppy's drawings quickly won the girl's trust. Melania stayed longer than she had planned, watching as the Carters began their transition. She observed James's physical therapy assessment, noting how the therapist's matter-of-fact approach helped him relax. She saw Poppy light up during her academic placement test, proudly showing off her math skills. But it was during a quiet moment in the courtyard that Melania witnessed something that made all the day's efforts worthwhile. Poppy had discovered a small garden plot where residents grew vegetables and flowers. As she excitedly explained her discovery to her father, James reached down and plucked a small daisy, tucking it behind her ear. The gesture was so natural, so paternal, that for a moment they looked like any other father and daughter sharing a special moment. "They'll be okay," Dr. Martinez said softly, joining Melania at the window. "It won't be easy, recovery never is. But they have something many of our residents don't, hope." Melania nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before them. "What about the legal implications?" she asked. "James's involvement with Mike's group." "The FBI has been briefed," Agent Cooper interjected, stepping forward. "Given Mr. Carter's cooperation and the circumstances of his involvement, they're more interested in using his testimony to build a case against the organization's leaders. His status as a decorated veteran works in his favor." As evening approached, Melania prepared to leave. She had meetings in Washington the next day that couldn't be postponed. But as she said her goodbyes, Poppy surprised her with another fierce hug. "Will you come back?" the girl asked, her voice muffled against Melania's dress. Of course, Melania promised, and she meant it. This wasn't just another charity case to be handled and forgotten. Something profound had shifted in her during this long, extraordinary day. Later, as her plane took off from Houston, Melania found herself looking through the day's photos on Claire's tablet. There were the standard shots from the charity event, perfectly composed and utterly forgettable. But then there was a candid photo someone had captured, Poppy's small hand in hers as they walked through the center, both of them smiling at some shared joke. "Claire," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I want to make some changes to our approach to veteran support programs." Her assistant looked up, stylus poised over her ever-present tablet. "What kind of changes, Mrs. Trump?" "Everything," Melania replied. "The whole system needs rethinking. One-time donations and photo opportunities aren't enough. We need sustainable solutions, real pathways to recovery." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "And I want to start with the families. Children like Poppy shouldn't have to pay the price for their parents' service to our country." As the lights of Houston faded behind them, Melania began outlining her vision. The day's events had shown her that real change happened not through grand gestures and speeches, but through direct, personal engagement with those in need. It was messy, complicated, and infinitely more challenging than traditional charity work. But it was also infinitely more rewarding. Unknown to her, at that very moment back at the Veterans Hope Center, Poppy was adding to her crayon drawing. Besides the two figures holding hands, she now added a building with flowers and a bright sun overhead. At the bottom, in careful letters, she wrote, "My new home." The morning's charity event seemed like a lifetime ago. The carefully crafted speech Melania had prepared was still in her purse, undelivered and unnecessary. Instead, she had learned more about real charity, about genuine human connection, than any scripted event could have taught her. But as her plane cruised through the darkness toward Washington, neither Melania or anyone else realized that this story was far from over. The ripples from this extraordinary day would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond the walls of the Veterans Hope Center, and challenging the very foundations of how America cared for its veterans and their families. Ripples of change. 1 month after the events in Houston, Melania Trump sat in her private office in the East Wing, surrounded by reports and statistics that painted a grim picture of veteran homelessness in America. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the stack of folders on her desk. Among them lay a crayon drawing, Poppy's latest artwork, showing her new classroom at the Veterans Hope Center. "The numbers are worse than we thought," Claire said, highlighting key points on her tablet. "According to our preliminary investigation, there are at least 12 other facilities similar to Mike's operation, preying on vulnerable veterans and their families." Melania leaned back in her chair, her expression troubled. The FBI's investigation into Mike's network had uncovered a disturbing pattern. What they'd discovered in Houston wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a larger web of exploitation targeting veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system. "And what about the VA reform proposal?" Melania asked, picking up another report. "It's facing resistance," Claire admitted. "Some say it's too ambitious, too expensive. But Dr. Martinez's data from the Veterans Hope Center is compelling. The comprehensive approach is showing remarkable results." As if to underscore this point, Claire pulled up a series of photos on her tablet. They showed James Carter in his new role as a peer counselor at the center, his military bearing now serving a different purpose as he helped other veterans navigate their own transitions. His prosthetic had been replaced with a more advanced model, and physical therapy had improved his mobility significantly. Another photo showed Poppy in her new classroom, her hand raised eagerly to answer a question. Her test scores had revealed a bright mind that had somehow managed to flourish despite years of instability. Her teacher reported that she had a particular talent for mathematics and art, an unusual combination that seemed to reflect both her practical nature and her creative spirit. But it was the last photo that caught Melania's attention. It showed James and Poppy working in the center's community garden, both of them laughing as they planted new seedlings. The transformation from the desperate pair she'd met in that Houston alley was remarkable. "Mrs. Trump?" Claire's voice interrupted her thoughts. "The press is asking for a statement about tomorrow's congressional hearing." Melania nodded, gathering her thoughts. Tomorrow, James Carter would testify before a House committee about veteran homelessness and exploitation. His story had caught the attention of several key legislators, and there was hope that his testimony might help push through much-needed reforms. "Tell them I'll be attending the hearing personally," Melania decided. "This isn't just about policy, it's about showing these families that someone is listening." Later that afternoon, Melania's schedule took an unexpected turn when Agent Stevens requested an urgent meeting. The Secret Service agent arrived with a thick folder and a grim expression. "We've uncovered something concerning," he began without preamble. "Remember how Mike kept claiming they had people everywhere? Turns out he wasn't entirely bluffing. We've identified a network of sympathizers within various veteran support organizations, people who've been deliberately sabotaging assistance efforts." He spread several photographs across Melania's desk. They showed familiar faces, mid-level bureaucrats, social workers, even a few charity executives. All of them, according to Stevens, had been working to maintain the cycle of veteran poverty and desperation that groups like Mike's relied upon for recruitment. "It's not just about ideology," Stevens explained. "There's money involved. These groups have been siphoning off funds meant for veteran assistance, using the desperate situations they help create to justify asking for more donations, which they then misappropriate." Melania felt her jaw tighten as she examined the evidence. "Have you shared this with the FBI?" "Yes, ma'am. They're preparing to move against several key players, but they're worried about the potential fallout. Some of these people are well connected." "Let them worry," Melania said firmly. "These people have betrayed not just their positions, but the very veterans they were supposed to help. They need to be exposed." As Stevens gathered his materials to leave, he paused. "There's one more thing, ma'am. We've received credible information about a planned protest at tomorrow's hearing. Some of Mike's old associates want to prevent James Carter from testifying." Melania straightened in her chair. "Have you informed James?" "Yes, ma'am. His response was, "Interesting." Stevens allowed himself a small smile. He said, and I quote, "My daughter taught me that doing the right thing is worth the risk." After Stevens left, Melania found herself drawn to the window, looking out over the White House grounds. The carefully manicured lawn seemed a world away from that Houston alley, yet the issues she'd encountered there had followed her back to Washington, demanding attention and action. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Martinez. The director had sent a video of Poppy giving a presentation to her class about her father's military service. The little girl stood proudly next to a hand-drawn poster, explaining to her classmates about sacrifice, duty, and the importance of helping others. The sight brought tears to Melania's eyes, but they were tears of determination rather than sadness. Tomorrow's hearing would be just the beginning. The system that had failed the Carters and countless others like them needed more than just minor adjustments, it needed a complete overhaul. She turned back to her desk and pressed the intercom. "Claire. Can you get me the latest draft of the VA reform proposal? And contact the White House legal team. I want to know exactly what executive actions are possible without waiting for congressional approval." As the afternoon sun began to fade, Melania immersed herself in the work. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance from those who profited from the broken system, skepticism from cynics who believed real change was impossible, and the ever-present inertia of bureaucracy. But she had seen firsthand what was possible when people chose to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. A little girl in a tattered blue dress had taught her that lesson, standing in front of a car to prevent harm to someone she barely knew. If Poppy could show such courage, how could those in positions of power do any less? As she prepared for the challenges ahead, Melania remembered something James had said during one of her visits to the Veterans Hope Center: sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Tomorrow, she would help him share that message with Congress, and hopefully, with the nation. But even as these plans took shape, forces were gathering that would test their resolve in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next 24 hours would prove crucial not just for the Carters, but for the entire system of veterans care in America. A new dawn. The morning of the congressional hearing dawned cold and clear in Washington, D.C. The Rayburn House office building stood imposing against the winter sky, its marble columns gleaming in the early light. Inside, Capitol Police and Secret Service agents conducted final security sweeps, their movements precise and purposeful. The day's schedule showed a routine oversight hearing, but there was nothing routine about the tension filling the corridors. James Carter stood at a window in the preparation room, absently adjusting his new tie. His reflection showed a transformed man, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by quiet determination, his military bearing restored by months of proper medical care and dignity. The suit he wore had been carefully chosen, conservative but not expensive, projecting respectability without hiding his veteran status. "You don't have to do this," Melania said softly, entering the room. She had arrived early, foregoing the usual security protocols that would have announced her presence. "We can find another way." James turned, offering a small smile. "Actually, I do have to do this. Not just for myself, but for all the others still out there. For their children." He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "Poppy asked me something interesting this morning before I left the center. She said, 'Dad, if you're scared of telling the truth, why do it?' You know what I told her?" Melania shook her head, though she suspected she knew where this was going. "I told her that sometimes being scared of doing something is exactly why you need to do it. Fear means it matters." He smoothed his tie one final time. "I've been afraid for so long, afraid of failing, afraid of asking for help, afraid of trusting the system again. But Poppy showed me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear." Before Melania could respond, Claire appeared at the door. "Mrs. Trump. They're ready to begin." The hearing room was already packed when they entered. Members of Congress sat behind their elevated desk, while the press gallery buzzed with anticipation. But it was the public seating area that caught Melania's attention. Mixed among the usual policy wonks and lobbyists were dozens of veterans, many still bearing visible wounds of their service. They had come to support one of their own. As James took his seat at the witness table, Agent Stevens appeared beside Melania. "We've identified several of Mike's associates in the crowd," he murmured. "They're being monitored. But there's something else, we've just received intelligence about a planned disruption. Someone leaked James's complete testimony to certain media outlets." Melania's eyes narrowed. The leak was clearly meant to undermine James's impact, to make his story seem rehearsed rather than authentic. How did James take the news? Like a soldier, Stevens replied with quiet admiration. He said, "Let them try to discredit me. The truth doesn't change just because people know it's coming." The hearing began with the usual formalities, the chairman's opening statement, introductions, sworn testimonies. But when James began to speak, the atmosphere in the room shifted. He didn't just tell his story, he laid bare the systematic failures that had led to it. He spoke about the endless bureaucracy that had denied him proper medical care, the well-meaning but inadequate programs that had failed to prevent his family's slide into homelessness, and the predatory groups that had exploited his desperation. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here because the system that failed me is still failing others. Right now, there are veterans living in alleys, their children going hungry, while money meant to help them disappears into a maze of bureaucracy and corruption." He went on to detail the network that Mike's group had built, explaining how they targeted vulnerable veterans, using their legitimate grievances to radicalize them against the very institutions meant to help them. But he also spoke about hope, about the Veterans Hope Center and its comprehensive approach to recovery. "The solution isn't just more money," he explained. "It's about creating a system that treats veterans and their families with dignity, that provides real pathways to recovery, that doesn't just put band-aids on bullet wounds." As James spoke, Melania noticed movement in the gallery. Several people were shifting uncomfortably, some even heading for the exits. She caught Agent Stevens's eye, and he nodded slightly. These were the sympathizers they'd identified, people whose comfortable positions were threatened by James's testimony. The question and answer period that followed was intense. Some committee members, clearly aligned with the status quo, tried to discredit James's testimony. They questioned his involvement with Mike's group, insinuated that his current situation at the Veterans Hope Center made him biased, even suggested that his daughter's role in the Houston incident had been staged. But James remained unshakable. When one congressman suggested that his story seemed too convenient, James responded with quiet dignity, "Sir, there was nothing convenient about watching my daughter grow up in an alley. Nothing convenient about feeling so desperate that I was willing to believe in anyone who offered hope, even if that hope came with hatred attached. The only convenience here is how easily some people can dismiss veterans suffering from the comfort of their offices." The hearing lasted for hours, but its impact was immediate. News outlets began running stories about the systemic issues James had identified. Veterans groups across the country started reporting similar patterns of exploitation. And most importantly, other veterans began coming forward with their own stories. But it was what happened after the hearing that truly demonstrated the power of one person's courage to effect change. As James left the building, he found the steps lined with veterans, some from the hearing, others who had heard about his testimony and come to show support. They stood at attention, offering silent salutes as he passed. At the bottom of the steps, a familiar small figure broke away from Dr. Martinez's side and ran to meet him. Poppy, dressed in a new blue dress that echoed her old one, threw herself into her father's arms. "You did it, Dad," she exclaimed, her face glowing with pride. James held her tight, tears streaming down his face. "We did it, sweetheart. We all did it." Melania, watching from the side, felt her own eyes fill with tears. The scene before her was worth more than any policy paper or press release. It was proof that real change was possible, that the system could be reformed, that hope could triumph over exploitation and despair. Later that evening, as the sun set over Washington, Melania sat in her office reviewing the day's events. Claire had brought her the early press coverage, mostly positive, though some outlets were already trying to spin James's testimony as politically motivated. "Mrs. Trump?" Claire's voice was hesitant. "There's something you should see." She handed over her tablet, showing a live feed from the Veterans Hope Center in Houston. The center's community room was packed with veterans and their families, all watching a replay of James's testimony. But it was what was happening in the background that caught Melania's attention. Poppy, who had flown back to Houston with Dr. Martinez, was moving through the crowd, handing out drawings. Each one showed a simple scene: two figures holding hands, a building with flowers, and a bright sun overhead. At the bottom of each picture, she had written, "Hope is stronger than fear." Melania smiled, remembering the first drawing Poppy had given her, now framed on her office wall. That simple crayon sketch had become a symbol of everything they were fighting for, the belief that every person, no matter their circumstances, deserved a chance at dignity and hope. The next morning's headlines would announce new initiatives for veteran care reform. Congressional committees would launch investigations into the misuse of veteran support funds. The FBI would make arrests in multiple cities, dismantling the network that had exploited vulnerable veterans. But the real story, the one that would truly matter in the years to come, was about how the courage of a little girl in a blue dress had set in motion changes that would help thousands of families. It was about how one act of kindness had sparked a movement for reform. And it was about how hope, when nurtured and supported, could transform not just individual lives but entire systems. As night fell over Washington, Melania added a final note to her diary: "Today I witnessed the power of truth spoken from the heart. But more than that, I was reminded that the greatest changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage." Poppy showed us the way. Now it's up to us to follow her example. The story of the beggar girl who saved the First Lady's life would be told many times in the years to come. But its true legacy would live on in the transformed lives of countless veterans and their families, in the reformed systems of support and care, and in the enduring truth that hope, combined with action, could overcome even the most entrenched injustice.